Now we're going to get started skinning the bass. As you recall from the last video, we carved it before we skinned it. And the reason we did that is so we could get accurate measurements and have a visual as we're actually carving it. The first step is to remove the slime coat that's on a fish. Because this bass was frozen, I was able to simply spray it off with cold water and it took all the slime away. If a fish is fresh, I would highly recommend freezing it before you plan on skinning it. It'll make it easier to skin and it will break down that slime coating. This is the show side of our bass. You can see that. If you recall, we had clipped off the pectoral fin to mark that. This is the side we're going to be making our seam on. This is a one-sided wall mount, so the seam will be running right down the center of the fish. If this was going to be a pedestal mount, your seam could run along the belly on one side of the anal fin, or it could run dorsally up here, depending on what kind of a scene it was going into. But because this is a one-sided wall mount, we're going to be going right down here. You can see that I have the fish on a piece of white paper. If you don't have white paper like this, newspaper works great. You can't have enough newspaper down. Also, if you slightly moisten the newspaper, it'll help you during the skinning process. If the paper is very wet, the scales can actually stick to the paper and come out. The first step in the skinning process is to remove the eyes and the meat that's in the cheeks, which is right here. We have a variety of tools we use for skinning. The tool we're going to use for that is a modified tool we made here. This is actually a kitchen butter knife, and we just simply put it on a grinder and ground it down to this point and just slightly sharpen it. We don't want it very sharp, just a little bit. If it's too sharp, we're going to cut the cheek meat. To remove the eye, we're going to take our tool, press it in right into the socket, kind of come up underneath the eye. And normally when I do this, I put my hand right over the top of it because you can actually have some juices from the eye spray out. So I'm just going to block the camera slightly here as I pull it out. You can see how I'm pulling it out. It's removed. Now we have to remove the meat that's in the cheek. We do that by taking our tool, coming right up under the socket, and staying right next to the skin. We're just going to start working it in. You can see where it is. It's right here now. And it's right underneath this skin and these scales. So we're kind of riding above the cheek meat. I turn the tool around this way, back in, and I push that all the way forward to where this maxillary bone is. My finger will show you right where it is. Turn the tool back around like this, the cutting edge facing me. I'm just pulling it back, and it's very easy to do. So it's very easy to cut it right along the top. We just bring it right up to the top of the cheek. Then what I do is I take the tool inside the cheek and I turn it down like this. I'm going to cut down to the bottom part of the cheekbone at this very top point. So I'm in like this and down. Now I'm going to swing underneath the meat, and my tool is now underneath the meat and it's resting on top of the cheekbone. I'm going to work it the same way I did on the top, right along, working it forward towards this maxillary bone. We don't want to cut through anything, any part of the cheek here or these scales or the bone underneath. We do not want to push through to the maxillary. We're just trying to remove the meat from inside. Okay, tool's back out. In this position, we're going to go back on top of the meat, come to this far point by the maxillary, and again, turn the tool, cut down. Okay, and then with the tool cut down, we're going to swing under the meat like this. So we cut down, we're underneath the meat again, and we're right along that cheekbone. You can hear it scraping. Okay, and we're going to go back on the top, same motion, and we're going to start to pull that cheek meat out. We're dislodging it from right along here now. You can see my tool working. I'm keeping my finger on it. You can see the cheek meat starting to come out. I'm going to put it back in. This way, again, cut down and then pull up towards myself. It came out in almost one piece. Now there's still some in there yet, and we're going to keep scraping it. But before we do that, I'm going to touch on the borax a little bit. This is powdered borax from Mackenzie. This is ideal for fish taxidermy. I like to put some of this on here right now. It helps to clean up some of these juices you're seeing, and it gives me a better hold when I'm working. You can hear that scraping motion. I'm just scraping the cheek meat off the bone. Right now there's no cheek meat at all attached to this top area of the cheek where the scales and the skin is. There's nothing there. It's just caught a little bit on the bone. So you have to just kind of go in there and pull around. You want to get as much removed as you possibly can without putting any holes in the cheek or cutting the cheek out. If you do, we can repair that during the finishing process. Now at this point, that's really all that this particular tool can do to get the cheek meat out. So I'm going to grab a different tool. This is a fish skinning knife. I'm going to put this in, again, graze along the top to the maxillary bone and just kind of pull down, and the teeth on this are going to grab on whatever little meat is in there yet I couldn't get with the first tool. And you can see that starting to come out now. You cannot be too thorough. If there's meat in there and you can safely remove it without putting any holes in, it needs to go. Any meat that's left will just distort when it dries and attract bugs. So that particular cheek is done. So I'm going to quickly do the other one just so you can see how I do it. Put a little bit of borax on here. Okay, we're going to cut right down into the eye, pull up. Break the eye out. Okay. We're going to go in. Grazing along the top, between the meat and the skin and the scales. Work my way back up to the top. Cut down. Work it back down to this maxillary bone. Tool out. Cut in, cut down. We're cutting down to the cheekbone. Start pulling up, dislodging the meat. Same procedure at the top, up, along the skin, cut down, start pulling that meat away. Now we just need to get the little pieces that are still stuck in there. Kind of helps when you're doing this if you take your tool and kind of push it up into this other bone cavity right here. There's a little bit of meat that always likes to get caught in there. Also, if you slightly scrape just underneath that cheekbone right here, you can see where my tool is. There's a little bit of meat that gets caught in there. Okay. We're just going to take our fish skinning knife. I'm just going to bring it on through to get the little pieces that are still left in there I couldn't grab with that tool. Again, getting a little bit of that borax in there does not hurt either to help grab those out. Right before we actually mount the fish, we'll come back in here one more time and just clean it up a little bit. Sometimes during the actual skinning process, some meat can find its way up in there, so we want to double check that. Okay, now we're ready to start skinning. Before we actually make our incision to start to skin the fish, I want to touch on one more quick thing. It's a good idea to take a picture of the fish before you skin it, not only so you can see the dimensions, but if you see anything with the vermiculations that stick out that you may want to recreate when you paint the fish. We would not want to paint the fish how it looks right here. This fish is faded out. Once they die, they lose their color. It's only going to continue to lose color through the mounting process. Some people make the mistake of painting bass as they're looking on their workbench when they take them in. That is not correct. You want to find reference pictures online, or if the customer provides you with fresh cut pictures, you want to paint it like that. That's very important. Also, if there's any damage, now's a good time to make a note of it with a picture so you can show your client that when it's completed that there was a little bit of damage and it's a natural part of the mount. So now we're going to actually start the skinning process. To do that, we use a shears. This easily will cut right through these skin and these scales and all these other junctures we need to cut the bones through. This makes very short work of doing it. There are other tools on the market you can also use, but you can simply buy one of these at a hardware store and it works great. Before I make the cut, I always want to double check that I am cutting on the correct side. So I take a quick look at my body again. It is facing the right. And we did not make any cuts on the right side, so we flip it back over to the left side and we prepare to make our cut. First thing we do is lift up the gill cover. We will be making our cut directly down the center of the fish. We do not want to follow the lateral line. The lateral line runs right where my finger is. Some people make the mistake of making the cut along that. Never do that. Also, this is a good time to just look at the middle line of the fish, the barring, which is the characteristic marks of a largemouth. They do not run along the lateral line. They start at the cleithrium center, and they only meet up with the lateral line right at the caudal peduncle, which starts here. That's very important, as you'll see some bass where the line is actually up here, where people paint them. It is incorrect. It starts right here. Basically at the point of the gill cover, which is right there. That's where it starts. As this fish dries, this is going to fade away and you may not even see this when we actually start our painting. So keeping note of exactly where that starts now is critically important. Our first cut will be right through the cleithrium bone. Again, directly in the center of the fish. We're right above the pectoral fin where we cut off earlier. We need to cut through the membrane by the gills. Now that membrane goes from my finger here all the way through to the throat latch. We do not want to cut through this throat latch. We want to keep that intact. If you do cut through it, we can fix it, but it's much easier if we do not cut that throat latch. So we're only going to come to right where my finger ends. Do not cut this bone at the throat latch at this time. On the top end of the gills, we will also cut through the membrane right back to where my finger is, which would be right here. We do not need to cut into the cavity of the head at all. We're just cutting through that thin membrane so we can open the skin up. I'm going to go ahead and make those cuts. Top. You want to leave as much of this membrane with the skin as possible. Be careful when you do this, you do not cut through the gills, because we are actually using the natural head on this bass. If you were going to use an artificial head, you could actually remove the head completely at this time. Largemouth bass do not have oils in the head that hinder drying. They dry very quickly, so we generally do not recommend using an artificial head on a largemouth. You could if you wanted to, and they are available commercially, and you could custom cast it. As a quick note, if you are going to use an artificial head, you would want to have that available when you're carving your body, so you could actually size your artificial head to the body. We're going to be using the natural fins on this bass. If you were going to be using artificial fins, you'd also need to size the fins to the body as we're carving it. The time to use artificial fins would be if these fins were extremely damaged, missing. Sometimes people will also use artificial fins because they don't want to deal with shrinkage issues on real fins, but on largemouth bass, the shrinkage issues are so minimal that we can easily rebuild it during the finishing process. So we're going to make our seam now right through the scales and the skin. We're not going to be digging into the meat at this point. We're just going to go right underneath, and we're going to come right down to the caudal peduncle ending, which is right where the tail starts. You're going to lose a few scales as you're cutting through the seam. That's fine. We came right to where the caudal peduncle ends. We did not cut out into the tail. So we have everything open up now, so we can actually start hinging the fish open. That's the purpose of this. We want to take the meat completely out without disturbing the show side scales. So it's going to be all opened up from this seam. Okay, we're going to take our fish skinning knife and start the cut. I like to start right at the center of the caudal peduncle, which is right here. What I'm going to do is just start working towards the head. I'm just cutting right under the skin. As you can see, there's our skin. Scales are on the other side of that. And I'm trying to leave as much meat as I can with the carcass of the fish, because it just saves time with fleshing later. If you do leave some meat like right here, that'll easily flesh off later. If you hear that little sound as I'm cutting through, exactly what you want to hear. I'm just cutting right underneath this bone. Cuts through real easy. My knife stopped right there. Hear that? It's just separating right from the skin. I push it up a little bit into the head cavity. Now that's all been released. Where we ended up here is right at the dorsal. What you're seeing here is the spiny dorsal, and this is the soft dorsal. I'm going to finish cutting down by the tail. Caudal peduncle has been released, and you can see how I push my thumb through there, actually release some of it. Make a few more little cuts, and that is the soft dorsal. So the caudal peduncle starts here. We've cut completely through that, open it right up to the tail. Now we're going to flip the fish around, and I'm going to start making my cuts on this side of the skin. This has all been opened up here. I'm going to lift up right on the end of the cleithrium bone, which we had split to make our incision. And just start cutting. It's a little more difficult to skin in this area. On spawning bass, the scales will want to pop out much easier, so you have to use a lot more care. You can see I'm just opening things up as I'm going here. I'm not trying to go way down with this first cut. I want to slowly work it all the way down and then work it down some more as I'm moving towards the belly area. You hear that sharp little clicking sound. That means we're just cutting or holding this skin to the meat. I got my thumb in here again at the caudal peduncle area. Open up that pocket right to the tail. You can see how that's opened up. Lift it back up and start working through here. This is a delicate area on bass. This whole belly or stomach area, you have to handle with care. If you start losing your grip a little bit here, you can take a little bit of your powdered borax and just put it on the skin. It doesn't hurt anything. If you start getting a lot of fluid buildup in the meat, you can also put some borax in here at this time. And it'll help catch that. Okay, now what I'm starting to do here is I'm starting to release the cleithrium bone, which is here, and it actually runs right down into here, into the gullet area of the fish and the throat latch. So I actually take my shears, and I'm going to cut right there and just release that cleithrium bone. See how it popped up? And I can take my fish skinning knife and I can grab onto that cleithrium bone, right like this. Put my thumb on the skin here, just pull. It pulls it right out. There's also another little bone here always. I can just grab right onto that, pull that right away. It's part of the rib cage of the fish. Now we're getting close to the pelvic fins. The pelvic fins, as you can see, are here, and we are right here. So I'm going to slowly start skinning down around this area. And get my thumb in there. You heard that sound? Those are those tendons releasing the meat. I'm not concentrating on getting a lot of meat out of this area yet, the throat latch. This is a very delicate area. It breaks out very easily. So I'm not worried about that now. I just want to get the bulk of the meat out. So we have the first front half of the pelvic fins released. Now we're going to work on the back. And this area here is the gut or belly of the fish. We need to work very slowly and carefully here or you'll pop scales. When you are holding the fish to skin it, you want it to be in a curve always. So I have my finger under it like this. You do not want to fold it like this. If you do that, you're going to pop all those scales out. This is a fairly tight bass as far as the scales go. Some spawning bass the scales will literally fall out as you skin it. So I'm just carefully going right along the belly now. This is, again, a very delicate area. I'm at the vent. What you're looking at right here is the anal fin. If you can remember from carving, we went over all this anatomy in depth. It can kind of give you an idea of where we're at. So I'm just going to keep this in a rounded configuration. I'm just going to turn it up on its back. I'm letting gravity start to pull the carcass this way now. You can see what I'm doing. I'm just trying to make sure I've got everything released along the belly of the fish. You can see here there's this slight little line here. That's the exact center of the fish, and that can be actually a little difficult to skin through. And we were able to keep almost all of it with the carcass. But when you do skin along that line, it will open up the stomach cavity of the fish, as you can see here. So I'm going to lay the fish back down, and we're going to cut through the pelvic fin bones. Now these two bones are paired directly together, and I just take my shears, I'm just kind of cutting around the meat first. The bones themselves actually angle towards the head. So I'm going to just swing around on them and cut towards the skin, like that. So here are our pelvic fins. I'm just going to skin a little more meat away. You can see where they are. They're still paired together. We're going to leave them like that for right now. Next step is to cut through the anal fin bone, which is right here. We've skinned all the way down to it. You don't want to keep skinning past where you just see it right here, because if you do, you're going to open up actually into your fin, and you do not want to do that. So I put my finger underneath it like this, hold it up in the air, take my shears, cut right along it, right to the vent. You can see we have it all freed up. Just going to skin a little bit more to open that area up so you can see what I did. All this meat and bone will be cleaned up during the fleshing process. But we want to get rid of this carcass as soon as we can so we can start fleshing it. So we don't want to be hanging around these areas too long. Now we have to detach the carcass from the tailbone or caudal fin. We're going to do that at the direct area where the tail fin starts and the body stops. This is right here. You can see that difference pretty clearly. You want to go right along that line for right now. During the fleshing process, we're going to cut in a little further. So I'm just going to get my shears underneath the corner. So right now where my shears actually is it's on the carcass on the shoal side. It's right underneath the skin. I'm just cutting through the bones and the meat. I'm making sure I'm not putting any holes in here. I just keep checking that. I keep my finger back here too, and I can feel if my shears had went through. If you do put a hole there, it can be easily fixed, but if you put less holes in, it'll make the whole process much easier for you. You can hear as you're cutting through the bones, and as long as you keep your finger on the other side, you can actually feel as you're making that progress around. Again, at this point, we don't need to get all the meat out or all the bones out. We just want to cut through it enough to get rid of that carcass. And there, we have it completely detached with no holes. Now we have to finish skinning the carcass out, and I always do that from the belly or the gut side. You can see we have some of those fluids pooling up in there. I'm going to just throw some borax in there. Makes it easier to work in. Put my fingers under here in a curve on this skin. Very important. I do have some borax on this side of the skin as well, so I have something to hold on to. I'm going to start skinning. Again, this is the delicate area. As we're on the shoal side, we're right by those delicate belly or stomach scales. So we want to be very careful there so they don't pop out. If you do lose a few scales, it can be fixed. But we want to try not to lose any if we possibly can. can see I'm just cutting through those tendons and sinews that are holding this meat onto that skin. Same by the peduncle region by the tail. We're just cutting right through. You see we've got that separated. Now we're working up towards the soft dorsal. You can see where we are there. And at this point, we're going to set the fish back down because we've opened up enough to where we can actually cut the bone that's attaching the spiny and the soft dorsal to the carcass. We do that by taking our shears, running it right up along that bone, flush like this, in, and just cutting it. You can hear it snap as you're going. You do not want to cut through the skin, obviously, onto the show side, so you want to go back and check and make sure you didn't do that. I like to keep my hand under there as well. You can feel if your shears is actually going through and you can stop. You get to the spiny dorsal, it gets a little harder to cut through. You can hear that snapping sound as we're cutting through the bones. So where we ended up is right here. So at this point, I lift up this bone, which is the top side of the cleithrium bone. If you remember, we made our incision here. I have to completely detach that from the carcass. So I'm putting my shears in right along the bone like this, making sure I don't cut through the top of the head or any of the cheekbone area. Get a couple of little snaps to release that. And that's all it's going to take for us to remove the carcass. And we have to put it back up again, let the carcass fall this way, and continue our skinning. You can see I'm leaving a lot of the meat right with the carcass. You can see that white area, that's the area that's directly touching onto the skin. And if you can keep that with the carcass, you have to do very little fleshing. Now, as I get up closer into the head, I'm right here with my cutter, my fish skinning knife. You can't really see exactly what you're doing, so I like to keep my hand here as I'm doing that. And I'm just listening and feeling as I'm going. For a few more strokes, and I lay it back down again. You can actually watch your cutter as it's making the cuts as you move up into the head cavity. Where I'm going is right where my finger is here. You can see that. I'm just working it underneath and watching it from this way to make sure I'm not actually cutting through. And that just released it from the top of the head. Now we have one more thing to cut before the carcass will actually be completely removed. This is the show side pectoral fin. We need to just cut straight in like that. You can angle it a little bit towards it, and that's been released. This is the meat that's going towards the throat latch. So we need to simply get that removed. We're not going to cut all the way back at this time. We're just cutting basically straight up from where the pectoral fin was, just to cut this meat so we can get rid of that carcass. Lay it back down. Now we need to cut through the esophagus. The esophagus is right here, right on it. And we just make one straight cut through, level with the gills. We don't want to cut too far into the esophagus this way because that's actually part of the show piece of the mouth. When people would look in the mouth, they would see that, and we would have to repair that if we cut through. Now that that's been completely cut through, we are right up to the vertebrae of the fish. And you can actually feel there, and you can get your cutter right between one of those vertebrae to make this cut. What I like to do is take my left hand and I like to put it underneath the fish when I do this, just to make sure I'm not digging down and cutting into the skin. Whenever you're skinning a fish, you should always try to have your cutter parallel with the skin, because then you won't accidentally cut through. So as you heard, I just snapped through that vertebrae. Now I just need to cut through the meat that's holding it into the brain cavity. And this is just meat up here. It'll cut through very easily. You can just pull it out, and we have the carcass removed. This fish actually has something very big in its stomach. Like any good taxidermist, it's always good to see what fish are eating. So let's take a look at what he was eating here. Looks like a sucker, actually. Looks like a pretty big one. There's a couple other minnows in there too, it looks like. that can actually augment the belly area enough that we can actually carve that into it. It stretches that. So that's kind of what we did when we actually did our carving on our form. So at this point, we don't need the carcass anymore. We can get that out of the building, and then we can move on to finish fleshing the bass.